Thank you, Boris. I'll try and give some perspectives on China from the ground. I've spent most of my life living in China, and I've witnessed and have been a part as an advisor to the government during different periods of time on the reforms that have brought China to where it is today. So I hope I can maybe give you some insights into that process and into where China is going right now. I'd like to really try and give you impressions rather than opinions, because the subject of China is highly emotional. People are either saying everything China did is great, or they're saying everything China did is wrong. And this is driven more by external perceptions. I think that much of what China has been doing has been experimentation. I think in many cases they did not necessarily know what they were doing at the time. And those experiments led to a series of events and capital flows into China that have created what we call the China miracle or the China model. But I would say that today nobody in China really believes there's a model. There's a set of experiments. Some worked very well, some had very damaging and tragic effects. And what we can try and do is piece together what worked, what didn't work, and what they're going to be doing next. I think it's also very important to put the context of change in China in the perspective of leadership cycles. Because what one set of leaders did and what another did are in fact very different. From the outside, one might think, From the outside, one might think that the leadership is all together on the same page and that it is one consistent set of policies, but this is in fact not the case. I often refer to the Communist Party of China as a franchise, something like McDonald's. It has at the very center a core set of rules, and it basically subcontracts those rules out to the different franchisees of the local government. So they have to achieve high growth rates, or they have to achieve the maintenance of stability, but how they do that, the central government often doesn't really care. And so if you want to keep the brand, you do within those policy frameworks, but how you do it is really up to the local condition. You could say something like McDonald's is the same. You know, you could have people putting in the local McDonald's putting dog food into the hamburger, and the corporate headquarters doesn't know it, you know, and they get away with it. So this happens. The key periods I want to talk about. First of all, Deng Xiaoping, roughly from, if we want to talk about the decade of his policies, was around 1982 up until 1992. I won't talk about it much because we know what happened. There was experimentation. They were having a debate. Should China have a market economy? Should it not have a market economy? And that debate went nowhere until 1992. And this was a key period when Zhu Rongji was the premier. First he was deputy vice premier, but he effectively had control over the economy for 1 decade. And this is the key period of transformation of China, where they really broke with the neoliberal model. China did not adopt the neoliberal model. It vociferously is against the neoliberal model. As Jeffrey Sachs, when he was here in Moscow, telling everybody to adopt shock therapy, I was in Laos, Vietnam, and Beijing, working with all of these governments saying, don't adopt shock therapy. Take it in sequencing, step by step. Some things you can adopt with the market, but unless you make sure that all pieces of the puzzle are in place, you can't do it. So you have to put those pieces in place first. So you first have to have land laws before you can have credit legislation, before you can have securitization on credit, and in turn it was a dismantling of the state system step by step, and the introduction of the market gradually. We call it sequencing. In turn, in the 90s, there were huge triangular debts between the state sector and the banks, and this took a decade to clear up. This was also Zhu Rongji's legacy. And of course, then managing the economy during the Asian financial crisis. Now, 10 years later, in 2002, China enters WTO and a new government comes in. And Wen Jiabao is the premier, Hu Jintao is the party secretary. It's a totally different game. And they adopt high growth rates through fixed asset infrastructure investment, frankly, blind investment, to drive the economy forward. And all of this notion came from something that Zhu Rongji said in 1998. He said he would give 3 guarantees: no more than 3% inflation, no less than 8% growth, and a stable currency. But that was in the context of the transformations that were taking place during his administration. But this 8% growth became a fixation. And so the government of Wen Jiabao had to have 8% growth or more. And of course, during these years of transformation, and particularly leading up to the Olympics, multinational corporations felt, oh, we have to outsource, China labor is cheap, potentially huge market, infinite market in China. And I think a lot of that was self-constructed mythology. Yes, Chinese labor was cheap. It's not cheap today. It's very expensive. The market is potentially huge, but believe me, the Chinese are not going to let the foreign companies really be able to take advantage of the market. They have many built-in protections, and they use those protections. And so you have, I think there was a statement made earlier today that about 80% of the foreign companies, only 20% of the American companies will stay in China, 80 are moving. I think that's probably correct. There's a lot of movement out of China right now because of these reasons. And this goes back to this 10 years of hypergrowth. Because the theory was to keep social political stability. China had to continue at over 8% growth, and to achieve that had to have massive rollout of infrastructure investment. Basically, it's cement, iron, and steel. Well, 10 years later, they achieved high growth rates, but they also have inflation, very high labor costs. One of the reasons why we have a real estate bubble is because the labor costs got so high that the factories of the south area, particularly Wenzhou, these areas that were famed for the manufacturing and the export boom, cannot operate. So they shut the factories down, and they use the land and they develop real estate because the money from the bank is cheap. And people buy real estate. Why do they buy it? Because there's insecurity. There is no social welfare. There is a social welfare net, but people do not know whether it can be realized or not. Meaning you pay Social Security, but nobody's been able to collect it yet. And you have a healthcare system which is in shambles. And so people are actually afraid to spend money. They will spend it on an apartment because they have to have a place to live. It's an essential commodity. All of this boom you've created, I think earlier this year Boris mentioned in Russia about 100 families of the oligarchy rich. Maybe in China you've got 1,000, okay? And they're not probably as rich as your Russian families or as rich as your Indian rich. They're rich, and they display their rich with a kind of conspicuous consumption. So when you go to Beijing today, you will find yourself in traffic jams that are as bad as Moscow, maybe worse. I refer to them as Lamborghini and Ferrari integrated parking lots, okay? They're not actually, the traffic doesn't move, you know, but it's very important for the rich to have face and to say, I have a Ferrari, I have a Lamborghini, I have this, I have that. But this is a really small percent of the population. So when a lot of Western businessmen come to Beijing and they get really ecstatic, they go, wow, there's so much wealth here, we're going to make a fortune. I'm saying, you know, this is not a place, this is not a land of opportunity, it's a land of landmines. You're going to be really careful in the China market, you know. And so you have this distorted economy, and it, in the eyes of many people, is not sustainable. Now, you have two different schools of thought. You have your kind of official party propaganda thinking, and you've got technical economists that are maybe at the director, deputy director, or even sub-department level, who will say in very frank conversations, we got big problems. But on the other hand, you have the official view, which is probably taken for granted by a lot of people, that post-2008 and the financial crash, China has the economic model. But it's not a model. It is a kind of, again, integrated set of experiences. Now, we are now in a new leadership regime. Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao have clearly stepped down. And we're in the first stage of that transition, which is the party has reassembled a new hierarchy. What we're waiting for in the springtime is there'll be a new lineup of government. Who will be the ministers? This is not yet announced. It's work in progress. But we know that at the top, the direction has changed. There was a lot of talk about scientific development, concept of scientific development at the last party congress. This is basically allowing Hu Jintao to step off the stage. Because what's fundamental is the new party general secretary, who will be state president, is also the chairman of the Central Military Commission. Now, for two previous leaderships, we did not have one person who was simultaneously taking the power of head of the party and the Central Military Commission. Mao Zedong once said, you know, the party has to control the gun, not the gun control the party. But Mao Zedong also said political power comes down the barrel of a gun. And so the leadership is quite clear about this. They have now a consolidated power for the first time. And so what is taking place now seems to be new directions and very clear articulated directions, different from the wishy-wash that has been the policy of the past 10 years. And this has both potentially great opportunity and potentially serious confrontation and disaster, depending on which route is taken and how they play the game. One of the things that I think has come up in the last party congress was, you heard over and over again, concept of scientific development. This is the old Hu Jintao line. It's basically Marxism, because Jiang Zemin said Marx was scientific. And therefore, the view was no spirituality, no, environment. These were not issues. That it was just straightforward industrial growth. High growth creates social stability because people have money and opportunity, and that's it. It was very monolithic, simplistic, straightforward. Okay, one word was mentioned in that speech, which is really important because it was never mentioned before. The concept of ecological civilization. Okay, now I'm going to cut through all the party gobbledygook. Deng Xiaoping said you need to have not just material civilization, which is consumption and wealth, you also need spiritual civilization. Jiang Zemin said you need both. Now Xi Jinping is going to say ecological civilization. If you go to the Beijing airport, where I left just a couple of days ago, it's plastered on all the propaganda, ecological civilization. So what does this mean? It means that China may be about to adjust its model of growth. And I'm working closely with a lot of people in the financial sector, and new ideas are coming up. We are proposing ideas. We are hoping the government will adopt these. Certainly the atmosphere seems positive. And those are how to create a new growth through smart green development. And again, the first level is going to be, once again, infrastructure investment in a heavy way. Don't think they're not going to do this. The history of China since the first emperor Qin Shi Huangdi in 228 BC was to build the Great Wall. The Great Wall was, the first emperor of China invented Keynesian economics. That was all about putting people to work. It wasn't about defense. It was a useless defense system. The Mongols, the Manchus, everybody else got through there. They didn't beat their way through. They bribed their way through. The bribing always works in China. And, you know, this thing was about creating jobs. And it was budgeted as military expenditure. You know, America, we do this. We have our whole internet development was under the military budget. It's a nice way to capitalize it, but it's really about growth and creating jobs. And so you had the Great Wall was rebuilt in the Han Dynasty and rebuilt again in the Ming Dynasty. They're always rebuilding this stuff, you know, it's the same thing. But now the question is, what's the growth model going to be? And the proposals being put forward is green growth. In other words, rather than building more roads, remember, back in Zhurongji's day, you had to build a road from the factory to the port because there was no way to get the goods there and you had to build a port. Now, Hu Jintao's day, they built 10, 20 roads. You don't need them. Okay? They collect dust, you know. So, you don't have enough Lamborghinis for the roads. So, what you need to do then is create another type of network. And that would be, of course, grid conversion. Because China, over the past decade, has gone to become the world's biggest polluter, the world's biggest emitter of carbon. And about 10 years ago, the official estimate, this is official Chinese estimate, is about 80,000 riots a year in the country. Now it's about 150,000 conservative estimate, so it's doubled. So all that high growth didn't create social political stability, it actually created more instability. And to a great extent, that instability was caused by environmental desecration. People go and they riot because there's a factory pumping chemical into their water systems. You've got, you know, rocketing leukemia because of water issues. And people are angry. And they want a clean environment. And they want to know that the food they eat is not full of contaminated junk. You know, even I was saying I can eat the tofu. I talked to one of the Chinese, you know, boxers, trainers. Tofu should be okay, right? It doesn't have all the hormones and junk in it. He goes, no, they use a plaster in the tofu. You know, be careful. So, you know, it's created a very, you know, unhealthy environment. So, back to the green grid. They've got to get off of fossil fuels. They have the potential to have massive solar. It's only right now renewables are less than 1% of their energy. It is an opportunity. Water conservancy is absolutely essential. The high carbon emissions are melting the glaciers of the Himalayas so quickly that, you know, this is actually the watershed, not only for the Yangtze, Yellow River, the Mekong, Irrawaddy, Salaween, Ganges, Brahmaputra, Indus rivers. Wow, if they lose the glaciers in the Himalayas because of the rate of carbon, you have war. It's going to be war between South Asia and China and Southeast Asia. It's coming. And so water conservancy is another area of massive infrastructure investment. They've got to drop the carbon output, and they know that. At the same time, Li Keqiang, the new premier, or he will be the new premier in March, he's ranked 3 in the party, so that's always the premier position, has basically indicated that urbanization of the whole country is going to be his legacy. But it's got to be smart green urbanization. They have to adopt then fiscal and credit policies to support smart green real estate, meaning that if you're in a room like this, every single light bulb has to be 80% energy efficient. Now, I'm not saying they've decided to do this. I'm saying that this is what a lot of us are talking about. And it is in the works. It is being discussed. Whether they end up doing it or not, this is the crossroads they're in. Because if they go back to the old model that they've been using for the past 10 years, then we have disaster. Because you're going to be just creating more blind growth and more social dislocation. So this is not, you know, a question of the growth of the Chinese economy. The question of political stability in China today is a question of economic sustainability. And for the investment bankers, that is the $1 trillion question. Thank you.